Courage speaks. Courage speaks. Courage speaks.
Welcome to episode 7 of Courage Speaks. I'm your host, Sam Sherman. Courage Speaks is brought to you by Courage to Connect, an outpatient mental health center for therapy, psychological testing, and psychiatry for all ages located in Chicago's North Shore. These days, it's become a frequent occurrence to come across articles or news stories highlighting the continuous efforts of artificial intelligence to simplify various aspects of our lives. Whether it's the advent of self-driving cars, the integration of automated customer service, or even the most recent experience of me trying out an AI-backed DJ on Spotify, artificial intelligence is undeniably permeating nearly every facet of society. So last year I came across a piece published in Scientific American that was written by science journalist Sara Reardon that I found absolutely fascinating. The piece is called AI Chatbots Could Help Provide Therapy, but Caution is Needed. After reading the piece, I sent an email to Sara to see if she'd join the show to talk more about the piece and how it came together, her career as a whole, and what it's like being a science journalist. She graciously agreed to join the show, and I am thrilled to finally share our conversation. With contributions to renowned publications like Nature, New Scientist, and Scientific American, just to name a few, Sara brings a global perspective gained from reporting on 5 continents and across the United States. Her expertise lies in illuminating the intricate connections between science, law, ethics, culture, and society. Join us as we explore the potential risks and rewards of artificial intelligence in providing therapy while considering the crucial importance of caution in this rapidly evolving field. Sara's insights promise to shed light on the promising yet nuanced landscape of artificial intelligence-powered mental health support. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Sara Reardon on episode 7 of Courage Speaks. So Sara Reardon, thank you so much for joining Courage Speaks. Really, we have been excited for this conversation. Wanted to first kind of get an idea of a little bit of your background. You have a master's degree in molecular biology, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And so master's degree in molecular biology, and now, you're a scientific or science reporter, science journalist. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
So I was years ago a broadcast journalism major in college, and now I'm a mental health counselor. So obviously yours seems to have more of a tie-in to that original to that original education. Now I'm doing sort of a podcast for the practice, but I love to hear how people kind of get into their current careers, to their current paths. So can you give me a little bit of background about how you found yourself doing what you do now?
So I was doing my PhD in neuroscience and molecular biology at the University of Washington, and just kind of realized that I liked learning about science more than I liked doing it. I liked learning about a lot of different fields rather than kind of being pigeonholed into studying a very narrow area of science, like how certain proteins would be interacting with other proteins, how they'd be driving something. It was all very interesting, but I wanted to learn about sort of the broad basis of science, lots of different fields. So I just started writing for some local newspapers in Seattle, and I got an internship eventually at Fermilab in Illinois and outside Chicago, and then went to Washington, D.C. to work for Science magazine for a little while. Bounced around to a few other jobs. Eventually ended up at Nature for 6 years in Washington, D.C., where I was covering neuroscience, mental health, government policy, funding for science, things like that, and have kind of went freelance a few years ago. Now I'm still writing for Nature a lot, as well as Scientific American, where this article appeared, some other clients. And I'm really interested in covering stories that have this sort of human angle where science is affecting people's lives in a very real way, and how people affect science in turn, and kind of how those priorities get driven. And yeah, I live in Montana now. It's a beautiful place out here, and get to cover all kinds of interesting stories. AI really seems like the hot topic of 2023. So I've been trying to kind of keep an eye on what's been going on there in terms of particularly how it's affecting science, health, and biology.
Yeah, so I first came upon your work the Scientific American, where AI chatbots could help provide therapy, but caution is needed. That's the name of your really outstanding piece that you wrote there. When I came across that, it's so interesting the way that you start out the piece talking about kind of exploring Reddit, because that's something where before I even read this piece, I had found myself in different Reddit forums looking at different mental health things. And I started to see more and more people posting about their experiences using AI chatbots in for sort of therapeutic contexts. And I had never really thought about that before. Even as we see AI creep into basically seemingly every part of society. And as I was reading these things, more and more people seem to be, again, it's the internet, so it's hard to say like how many people this really is, relatively speaking, but at least a lot of people in these forums were sharing their experiences, talking about how this is so much easier, so much better, all these different things. And of course, I had these two maybe conflicting thoughts. The first one was, oh, that I'm going into this field now, like a human going into this field. Is this like a threat? That was the first thing. But then the second thing I thought was, well, I want people to have access, accessibility in mental health, as you write about in the piece, is a big issue all across the world, let alone in the United States. And something I'm very passionate about is figuring out those ways to make these things more accessible, right? So if I don't ever want to say that if something's helping somebody, that's not that's not a good thing. But I really love your piece because you really dive into all those questions, a lot of those questions that I had, and a lot of the kind of different colored flags that went up as I was reading those Reddit posts and kind of doing a little bit more research on that end. So I guess first, before we kind of get into the specifics of the piece, what first got you interested in writing about, you said that you've covered mental health in the past, but was it on Reddit? Like, did you find yourself on Reddit seeing that? Like, was that before or after starting writing the piece that you were doing some of that kind of collection?
Well, the really honest answer that you probably don't want to include in your podcast is Scientific American just asked me to.
No, that's
But
fine. I had a feeling I had a feeling
yeah.
that was one of the options. So.
Yeah, no, they were trying to do sort of a informal series on AI and health. And so I had done a previous one about how it could help in healthcare in general,
Mhm.
whether it was good at diagnosing patients in hospitals. And then I lied. I did pitch this one knowing that they had that general focus. But a lot of people have been mentioning mental health as one of the areas where that could be most helpful because it is, I think I quoted in the article, former NIMH director Tom Insel
Mhm.
saying that this was one of the areas where they really, all of therapy is just talk. It's just conversation between you and another entity, let's say,
Mhm.
as opposed to like surgery isn't going to be governed by AI anytime soon.
Right.
Even like lots of other diseases require some sort of specialized training, specialized tests, whereas this is just you really can put in the place of a therapist. You can actually put in this chatbot right now. How good it is might be another question, but in terms of just the medium, this one really lends itself well. And I had heard before about some of these other apps that have been around for a few years. They aren't powered by ChatGPT. Um, and I think I mentioned there was one that came around in the 90s where they were trying to put in CBT, cognitive behavioral
Mhm.
therapy, which is just this very formalized question and answer. How do I reframe my thinking? How do I uh, look at different alternatives for how this thing might be affecting me? And you can do that as sort of like a internet quiz kind of a thing. So that worked very well. Um, and now that we've got a little more ability to learn from what the person is saying, a little more complex, realistic kind of feedback it can give you, those sorts of apps were really able to take off to start talking to people in that way. And now ChatGPT has come along in the last year or so and just kind of kicked everything up exponentially in terms of how realistic it feels, how much it can learn from you and respond and carry on a conversation that you've been having for a long time with it. And so it seemed like a really interesting time to do that. And so then I went to Reddit to see if this is something people have actually been doing or if this is just something that these companies, these Silicon Valley companies are sort of touting. And it seems like people do sort of seem to think this is useful, at least for some people.
Mhm.
They can even ask it to be like, oh, I'm a counselor from Alabama and I have this kind of personality and I'm going to talk to you like this, like I am this real person. And if you're if you're isolated, especially during COVID, I think a lot of people really wanted someone to talk to. It kind of primed the pump for this to take off as soon as the apps and the AI got good enough.
As you were sort of putting this piece together, of course, and I have to dust off my, broadcast journalism degree from a long time ago. Like, again, that's in the past. But I do seem to recall kind of going into pieces, you want to be objective and all that kind of stuff in terms of, just kind of all the everything kind of fall into place in terms of what your findings and your research. But I thought it was interesting because as I was reading the piece and as I was kind of doing some more supplemental research around this, it kind of clicked to me of thinking about like going into it. Did anything surprise you based on like kind of going into the piece of what you maybe were expecting or theorizing around kind of your findings, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so going into it, I was very skeptical, and I still have a certain amount of skepticism, which I'll get to in a second. But I mean, my initial thought is that if I am depressed, if I'm feeling isolated, the last thing that I would want to do is be like, well, I don't even have a human I can talk to. I have nobody in
Mm-hmm.
the world. At least I could talk to a computer. That just seems very sad to me personally. I think that would be sort of a frustrating place to be. And I think it probably does depend on the person, like whether you're going to think about it that way, or whether you really need help from I'm stuck in this mindset. I can't possibly think of my life in any other way other than everyone hates me. I have no friends, whatever it is that you're dealing with. And but these therapy programs are proven to work. CBT, some of these other ones that they're going
Mm-hmm.
through. I think there's some work in addiction, things like that. And just if it actually is helping you reframe your thinking in that way, if it actually is helping you turn your mind around and get into a more healthy state, these are things that have never occurred to you before, or just having a periodic reminder of like, hey, things aren't so bad. Here's some alternatives. I see where that could be helpful if you have never, these things have never occurred to you before, and the AI can tell you and really personalize itself to you and what you're saying and come up with a sort of a solution, or at least given the input that it has. I see where that could be helpful. But yeah, the idea of having a human to talk to, and I think that is still where these programs probably will fall short for some people, is actually having that human physical connection.
Mm-hmm.
That's and not knowing deep down, but it is just a machine. It is just programmed to be responding in this way. I think that it's just kind of where you're coming from, where you're starting out with, what you want from it to get out of it. I think is going to be it's going to be important as to whether or not it's going to work for any given individual.
There was something in the piece that I was pretty surprised about. It said that it was talking about the therapy, like there was a part in it where you're talking about sort of therapeutic alliance that's built between a individual and a clinician, and that in certain studies they've actually shown that like with certain services that alliance had been formed in like 4 days or something, whereas with like a human it can take months or something like that. That was kind of interesting, of like where you're trusting the AI as something to communicate with in a shorter amount of time than in yeah, I mean, I don't know, that was sort of interesting to me because that was one where I read it and I was like, well, that's that's definitely not what I would expect.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that probably is a function of how much you're using it, because unless you're in inpatient treatment, you're not talking to your therapist every single day. You're not talking to them at 3 a.m. when you're laying awake
Right,
in bed, unable
right.
to sleep, and you have your phone there. You can go ahead and talk to the Chat GPT. It's there for you, or not Chat GPT, but whatever app it is you're
Hmm.
using. It's there for you. And so if you are like really excited using this thing, like, oh, someone's actually coming up with different ways to think about things. Someone's actually telling me the things that I've been missing in my life, and using it a lot. I could see where that alliance would form very quickly. Whereas if you're trying to get in to see a therapist, you've maybe at most once a week you're seeing
Hmm.
that person. So that would take a lot longer to do, and they've got all of their like administrative things they've got to go through. They've got their questions they want to ask, and it's not necessarily you can't direct the conversation quite as 100% it's on you as you would if you're just using an app that's talking back to you.
What did you find? Because one of the parts of the piece that I think has actually come across in a lot of writing about AI, or a lot of kind of critiques or about it, is that it seems like this balance that people are striking is looking at it as like an assistant, like utilizing it as like as a resource, as an assistant to whatever the primary human, work that's being done. Can you talk a little bit about what you found kind of from that side of it, about how people are looking at it as maybe utilizing it as like a therapist's assistant, or utilizing it in that way?
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly like I was just saying. Like you can only talk to your therapist so often. You can't talk to them at 3 a.m.
Hmm.
usually. And so it's kind of like if you need help in the moment, if you're really struggling at a particular moment, you need to talk to somebody right now, it's
Hmm.
there for you. I think it could also maybe sort of raise some questions in your mind if you're just sitting there using it on your own, that then you could bring back and talk to your therapist about in the future. Like this just occurred to me when I was talking to the AI. Can you help me work through this now as a human?
Right.
And I think, like I was talking before about that other piece I did in medicine, and I think that's where doctors are excited about it more in general, is like in terms of a starting point, something that's around 24/7, something that can help people kind of get to a different sort of baseline once they do go in and talk to the person than they would have been if they just are completely relying on that human therapist or physician.
And where did you find a lot of these places, like the places that either have been around since, let's say, like the 90s, with a couple of those sort of CBT based services, and even of course more recently, in the kind of cliche of like the follow the money, I'm always curious, like who seems to be funding? Are these sort of privately funded? Where did you find that a lot of these are kind of sourced from, as far as putting their money behind these different programs?
You mean the existing ones, the apps, or kind of the
The
research,
I
like
would
still in research
say
phase?
I'd be curious, actually, both. So initially I was thinking about the apps themselves, but also I guess the research, if you know who was funding those as well.
I mean, like in terms of the research, you've got the NIH, other
Right.
yeah, general funding agencies, foundations. I think a lot of the apps are sort of typical startups, or at least started out that way with angel investors or advertisers. I'm not sure. I haven't actually used many of these apps myself. They might have some like ad-supported versions, but
Hmm.
I mean, they're just sort of a typical app. I'm not sure there's any really interesting funding agency involved there,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
don't quote
So
me on that because I honestly didn't look into it that
no,
deeply.
no, that's okay. I may do some more around that, because it's like, I don't know. You look at kind of like the upside of it can be this expanded accessibility, can be potentially more cost effective than traditional therapy services.
Mm,
But then on the other side of it, and I think you bring this up in your piece, that at some, like, down the road, will this, like, once these are, I've heard people talk about AI before, where it's like, this is the worst it's ever going to be, as it is right
mhm.
now. So which is kind of, I don't know, something maybe
I don't know how
personally
anyone knows
speaking.
that.
Yeah, exactly. I know, yeah, but if that's the case, and we get to a point where it's these like really perfect system, whatever is in terms of the apps and in the therapy settings and mental health settings, then they would become potentially subscription based and like higher cost, and then you kind of create the same issue that is already present. So I wonder about like
Mhm.
the risks of even that happening down the road. I don't know, there's just something about that to me, of like, who's behind these things, because it seems like the initial intentions are very pure, of like wanting to, everyone's trying to make a buck, but at the same time, if you can expand accessibility, if you can kind of lower the barriers to care, barriers to
Mhm.
treatment for people, or lessen those, then I think there's definitely, potential there. But I guess, will it just end up being ending up at the same place?
Yeah, well, I think that's something that's still to be determined. I can't remember. I need to see if it actually ended up in the piece or not. But one of the app founders that I was talking to said he'd seen a lot of people just kind of creating stuff with ChatGPT on its own and directing it in certain ways. There was one that he'd come across, which was like trying to sell supplements, like dietary supplements, was what it came was like programmed to tell you was the ultimate answer to everything. And so
Yeah.
I think that there is the potential for that sort of thing to show up a lot more, since there's not a whole lot of regulation going on in this space right now. People are going to be using it in, I don't want to say devious, but sort of marketing driven ways to try and sell something, to try and get some information from you, maybe even scam people in some ways under this sort of guise of a mental health therapy app.
Right.
I think that comes down to a lot of the point that a lot of people were trying to make in there is that we need some sort of regulation. We need some sort of oversight to make sure these are being done ethically. They're being done in a way that's not going to harm people or even just take advantage of people, even if it's not particularly harmful.
So is it kind of the lack of regulation currently that might be leading, like I wonder kind of like as far as the legality, because there has been some, and I think you noted, I believe one, at least one of them in the piece, some of the murkiness around some of the specifically around like one of the apps that was being sought for like eating disorders, and how there was some
Mhm.
triggering language being used in messaging. And I wonder to, the legal side of it, from what you know from researching with the piece or just in general, how vulnerable are these companies right now to to lawsuits or to different, legal risks
I'm
or
not,
yeah.
yeah, I'm not sure they are. I'm not sure there is a whole lot of, 'cause there are some sort of exemptions that have been carved out for companies just in terms of like libel law. Even Facebook
Mm,
isn't liable if you post something libelous or something that's threatening someone. And I think that there's just a lot of gray area about who's ultimately going to be responsible if someone's harmed. Is it the app? Is it the underlying API? Is it the company that's developed it? Is it the therapist who allowed their patient to use this app? I think that yeah, it hasn't really been tested that much legally yet.
this is reminding me, the first episode of the podcast was actually about, I spoke to a researcher who is sort of an expert in gambling addiction, and he was talking about, sort of kind of reminding me of this, where right now everyone's kind of doing everything they can because there's a lot of money being made in sports gambling and in legalized betting and all that stuff, without thinking about kind of the future potential risks. And the more that, because it's like, if you can make the money now, you're going to try to make the money now without thinking about the future, when in the future, when we talk about regulation, there probably will be like forced correction, as he kind of referred to it as, which I know it's a little bit different, but it makes me think that like there could be safeguards getting put in place now, research based, right, within some of these apps and within this research, and how these things are being developed. It doesn't sound like, I mean, there's the research that's kind of starting to go in this, and it's all relatively new, but I do wonder if without more of that, at least on the front end, as these are continually being developed and marketed, if we won't see, forced corrections down the road as government agencies potentially get involved, or more things come out, or risks and all that kind of stuff. So kind of just kind of zooming out a little bit, when I'm hearing about your background and kind of listening to like the different stops that you've had. So I have to ask what it's been to be like. So when did you start again your sort of journalistic career, or your journalism career?
Like what year or?
Yeah, what year?
Um, I guess 2010. I was yeah, in grad school and started like doing internships and things.
So I'm just thinking that between 2010 and 2023 now, being a science journalist, being a science reporter, I don't know the best way to ask this question, but I guess I'm just curious what it's been like. I'm sure being a science reporter at any time in history is going to have unique challenges or unique contexts, but it really seems like between, just in the last 10 years, to see how these conversations around science and conversations around these things have changed in a lot of different directions. What's your experience been like, I guess, just working in this field in a very what seems like unprecedented time of the way people perceive and read facts in science?
You mean science generally, not just AI? Because that's
Oh
that's
yes,
not
I
my
would say
primary beat. Okay, I was say
yeah,
I
science
can't speak
generally.
too much to AI.
Yeah,
Um,
science in general.
yeah, well, I mean, like 9/11 changed everything, COVID changed everything.
Yeah.
It's really been some interesting sort of flip-flops in who is believing science, who's trusting the government, who's trusting different sources. Like when I started, I wrote about how it was mostly like, as an example, liberals tended to be much more skeptical of vaccines. And that's completely changed now.
Hmm.
There's kind of this idea of a war on science, and that's kind of changed in different ways as well. Funding for science has been going up and down with each administration. Sort of the different priorities have gone up and down with each administration. Yeah, I mean, I mostly cover like molecular biology, developmental biology, neuroscience. There have been huge advances there in genetic engineering. That's been one thing that I've covered a lot. That's just completely different than it was 10 years ago. Yeah, I'm not really sure. Like, kind
No,
of a
it's
broad question,
yeah,
but
no, I know it definitely a broad question. I guess it's just like you said, there's these different things that have sort of changed the way that people think. I think or perceive COVID being the most sort of recent, where it really seems like it's just like that, like even working in the field of mental health, as we sort of talk about this like collective experience, collective trauma that really happened to the whole world, right? And
Mhm.
how we don't know so much of the impacts, right? Like people talk about post COVID, we're not really post COVID at all. We're sort of
Yeah.
still in it, but so it's interesting to kind of think about it that way. So I guess just to kind of, as we sort of wind down a little bit here, what are some things, because it's interesting. When I was first read the piece in Scientific American, and then was looking at the other things that, I mean, you write about like so many different kinds of things. I mean, it's been really
I
fun
do.
kind of going through all of your work. I'm going to put out links to these things when with the episode release, because I hope people check out some of the stuff I mean, going back, the last several years, there's some really cool topics and ones that kind of got me thinking in areas outside of all this. But can you share anything about some of the stuff that you're working on now, or even things that you've been interested in, and maybe exploring, and again, not even necessarily specific to mental health, or if there is anything there, of course, but what's kind of on your mind these days?
I've been writing a lot this year about psychedelics in terms of mental health.
Hmm.
And I've been following ketamine, which may or may not be a psychedelic depending on how you define it.
Right.
That's its own whole story. But yeah, I've been following ketamine for a long time because it's a really interesting drug in terms of how many antidepressants don't work for a lot of people, and suddenly this one will just change things for people who have failed on a dozen different drugs, just because it works so differently from anything we know. And we really don't understand well at all on a molecular level, on a psychological level, how it's working. Psilocybin, MDMA, a lot of these other drugs are being tested right now and very close to approval. Like MDMA is very likely going to be approved as a PTSD treatment within the next year by the FDA. So that's just going to be huge for mental health because it's going to kind of open the door to a lot more research, a lot more development of things like that for different indications. So I found that story fascinating. I'm working on something right now about how little we actually know about how any of these work. Though you could really say that about any antidepressant. To be fair, we don't really understand how a
Right.
lot of psychiatric drugs are working. So that's been a topic I've been really interested in. Genetic engineering is another one. CRISPR, you probably have heard of. It's a way to actually change the DNA code in a much quicker, more efficient way than has ever been done. And so we've suddenly got this ability to modify lots of different animals. You don't have to just use mice anymore. You can study octopuses, you can study chickens, you can make any sort of genetically modified critter you want to ask different scientific questions. And it's being used in medicine now more too, to actually edit someone's cells to get rid of the receptor for HIV, for instance, or
Oh,
to
wow. Hmm.
have a cancer treatment to replace certain blood cells. So yeah, so that's been a really fascinating topic. What else am I working on? I see a story about in Science about drug cartels in Mexico and trying to model how they interact and grow and what kinds of different. This is sort of a algorithm AI kind of application, trying to understand how we could actually effectively combat drug cartels. And that's something I've been
Oh,
interesting
wow.
too, is sort of this modeling for different things. I did a story a few years ago about modeling the opioid epidemic and what sorts of policy conclusions we could draw from creating these giant AI models. So yeah, just like all kinds of new
Yeah.
technology, but really, yeah, really all over the board. Anything that has vaguely to do with biomedical research, I've been interested in covering.
It sounds like it's kind of a different, you have one of these great jobs, which is like it's something new every day. Like there's going to be different things every single day that you're working on.
It
Uh,
really is, yeah. And I loved being in college. I loved being a student, just taking all kinds of different classes in different areas and learning about a lot of different things. I really believe that anything gets interesting if you look at it closely enough, even a topic that you don't think is interesting on the surface. If you really start digging into it, I think there's always something, some cool story to be found. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a lot of fun.
The last question I have for you is one that this is going to be probably the broadest question, but
Right.
as someone who has covered that has a master's in molecular biology, you have a master's in it. I can barely pronounce it, and then has now been a reporter and a journalist working in the field for over a decade. The next thing that I guess comes to mind for me is just thinking, when you think to the future, as personal as you can answer this question, has being as involved in understanding, researching, talking to the people in these areas made you more optimistic or less optimistic about the future, the more that you know and the more that you've learned about science? And again, this is
Oh, so I have to answer that.
did you say, do you have to answer that?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. It
if I
depends on which
asked
area.
it,
It depends on which area you're asking.
yeah, I guess that's a good point. Well, I don't know. I mean, in just a couple of these things. So like when I think about like artificial intelligence, if I were to just like highlight a couple of these things, like genetic engineering, and I don't know, that's that I really probably should have thought more specifically, because broadly it's probably maybe I don't know, a different answer. Is it, or is it a mixed bag? I mean, I don't know. Do you, even if you don't share your exact answer to the question, does it seem more like too hard of a question to answer?
I think that there is incredible potential right now with some of these things that are being developed with genetic engineering, AI, ChatGPT, the topics we've been talking about. There's tremendous potential. There's also tremendous potential for abuse if the wrong interests, wrong hands start kind of taking them over and making them something that the people who are creating them right now with the ground level are not imagining that they will be. And I think that that's kind of just built out of history of what we've seen with the internet, to give a random example. Like
Mhm.
lots of great things, lots of abuse. And it's really hard to say. Yeah, lots of good things can come out of it, but I mean, there's a lot of power, a lot of money, a lot of regulation potential that is kind of scary as well. And yeah, I don't really know what more to say about that. Can't see the future, which I wish I could.
Yeah, well, that's the thing though, is I think you're in a unique position where there's a lot that you probably have seen more of the future than like the average, average citizen, just in terms of the work that you do. And but like you said, I mean, it sounds like it is like anything else, where these things are going to be put in place. They're going to be made available almost no matter what. It's just a matter of who's implementing them, who's, how they're being regulated, where they're being regulated.
Yeah,
I guess
sure.
we'll,
Well,
yeah,
yeah, like take the mRNA vaccines, for instance. Like those are such a huge scientific breakthrough. We can
yeah,
make vaccines for anything in a weekend now. I mean, there's lots more testing that needs to be done, but just in terms of from a starting point, it's amazing how quickly we are able to come up with vaccines for COVID, and now we can apply them to all sorts of different diseases. But same time, this is still an IP that's concentrated in a few hands. It's not something that's going to immediately be available to the rest of the world, and
right.
especially not to places that is really needed the worst. There's still going to be a lot of sort of the infrastructure and the power imbalances. Those have not been solved by this new technology. So I mean, the
Hmm.
technology in and of itself is neutral. It's neither good nor bad. It's just kind
Right.
of how we end up implementing it.
Yeah, yeah. Which even just that last point that you made, I would hope that more people understood that point of it, which is the thing itself is not,
Yeah.
it doesn't have,
Usually,
I
yeah.
guess, yeah, usually we'll put that disclaimer
Yeah.
there. Well, Sarah, thank you so much. Thank you for the work that you do. Again, I cannot imagine working in this space in the time that we're in, but you're doing some really incredible work, and I'm excited for our listeners to read this piece, and hopefully all of your other pieces from the last several years and onward. So really thanks for joining Courage Speaks.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Thank you again to Sara Reardon for joining Courage Speaks. If you'd like to read more of Sara's work, you can visit sarareardon.com. That's SaraReardon.com. Thanks as always to John Marikoski for writing and producing our beautiful theme music, and thank you for tuning into Courage Speaks. We want to remind our listeners that the information and discussions presented in this podcast are intended solely for educational purposes. The content provided is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. It's important to consult with qualified mental health professionals or healthcare providers for personalized guidance regarding your individual situation. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, the field of mental health is complex and ever-evolving. The views and opinions expressed by the host, guests, or participants are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of Courage to Connect Mental Health Center. For Courage Speaks, I'm your host, Sam Sherman. Talk soon.